Canon R5 Mark II. It's Canon's latest addition to their lineup, and we've been heavily testing the camera, starting with some pretty decent conditions you saw in the last video, and more recently, a week above the Arctic Circle in some very tough shooting conditions, including rain, snow, and high winds, amongst the muck of the tundra to the dark sandy beaches along the Arctic Ocean. So how did it hold up, and what do you think of this camera after this incredible time in the Arctic tundra? Well, let's talk about it. Now, before we get started, this review is from my testing and how I shoot and what my needs are as a wildlife photographer, and the environments of the subjects that I shoot, and my workflow. What I need is very stable, reliable autofocus, ability to see what I'm looking through the viewfinder, and all the shooting info to understand what the camera sees, and what the autofocus that gets the lens to the right spot to get that good hit rate and little or no drift. Ability to stay in the viewfinder, not had to fuss around the settings, a good balance in the hand, good image stabilization in stills and video. The ability to switch in and out of stills and video very easily, good colors in the image, and good IQ, as the image is the real measure of a good camera. If I can get those things, then I'm going to be happy. How you shoot and what your needs are for the camera may be different than mine, so keep that in mind. The things that are tested and compared to are things that I need to know about the camera. I've given thought to what others may want to know, and some of that may be in this review. If you don't see the things that you're curious about and that we don't cover, just leave me a note in the comments, and we'll be more likely in a future video cover those items. This review will also be about the Canon R5 Mark II on its own for now. We'll have a video very soon on the comparison to its predecessor, the R5, and more than likely a comparison against the Nikon Z8 and Z9 cameras. So the camera itself is a 45 megapixel backside limited stack sensor camera, full frame with a 6.3 millisecond readout speed. Now, as far as how the camera feels in the hand, it feels really good. It's a little bit thicker than its predecessor, which I like. I like a little bit bigger, heavier feeling cameras in my opinion. They just feel really good in the hand. And on this one I've added the battery group. It's the BGR20. If I got that wrong, I'll put it up here. And it runs about $350. It is a little expensive, but to me, for wildlife photography, this is the flagship camera. The R1 is for wildlife photography. It's be a good camera, but we may talk about that in a future video, why I chose this over the R1. But I think really for wildlife photography, you need 30 plus megapixels to really have ability to crop and resize your images and to get more detail. Anything below that to me is just a little lacking in today's type of cameras. And 45 on this one feels really good when I go in to edit the images and look at the quality of the images. As far as the battery grip goes, it is really good. It does have one little glitch that I've found. We passed this along to Canon also. So starting with the negative already on the camera. And that is when you run out of your first battery, because how the battery grips works in this guy is it drains the first battery, then it goes to the second. But what I noticed the 2 times that I drained the battery, yes, the only 2 times I drained the first battery, believe it or not, with all the road work I've done, is it said I was out of battery, and it was just the first battery. I knew it couldn't be drained. So the first time that happened, I popped the batteries, swapped their positions, put it back in, turned the camera back on, said I had 50%, which is the one battery left. The second time it happened, all I did was turn the camera off, pop the battery, put it back on, didn't swap it, and again, I was at 50%. So I never ran out of that first battery again, never hit that 50% mark, because I usually, by the time I hit that, in the middle of the day, I'd plugged it back into a charger to get it brought back up. But that may be a glitch in the camera. So if you see that, that's the fix for it. We did pass that along to Canon to say this may be a possible glitch. If it happens more often, I'll let you know. But that is the only really thing I've found on this camera. The only other bad thing I found on the camera is only one time is it locked up on me. And all I had to do there was turn the camera on and off, pop the battery, put it back in, and it fired back up. That happened once in the whole time I shot this camera, and I shot this camera a lot over the last week plus. It has been in my hand firing off the whole time. So we did have one lockup, and we did have the battery issue. Other than that, I didn't have any problems with this camera so far. Now let's get into the rest of this about the feel and the buttons and everything. So as far as the button layout, everything I like where it's at, kinda. As far as the shutter, the aperture, your dials in the back where I signed the ISO, everything, the AF on, all the buttons on here are pretty close to its predecessor and all my other Canon cameras. So it's really, intuitive to hold on to. Nothing is different really here on the camera. As far as the differences on the camera, it's more like across in the R7 and the R6 Mark II. You have your on-off switch up here at top to turn the camera on and to lock. What is the lock for? Well, if you hit the lock, you can't change your settings on the camera. You can focus and you can hold the shutter, but you can't change your exposure triangle. And on the left, we have now the dedicated stills to video switch. I like having a stills to video switch. The last predecessor, we had a button assigned to jump to video and stills. That was fine too. But I really like a dedicated switch on here so I don't bump anything accidentally and turn the video recording on, or even video, and it should be in stills. But what I don't like about it, this is one of the few gripes I have, is it's on the left. The reason being is if I'm holding a big lens up here and I need to flip to video, I've got to take my hand, if I'm hand holding this, I've got to take my hand off that lens, brace this thing, and then flip it to video. If it was on the right, I could just use my finger to flip it, kind of like with the R7, over to video real quickly. The reason is if I'm shooting stills with the work I do, I'm shooting stills the exact same animal, I want to jump to video, so I'll flip it over to video, and I don't lose my subject. I'm still looking down the barrel of the lens. But if I have to drop that lens off my eye, put it to video, bring it back up, I have to reacquire the bird. And that's sometimes not real easy, but it's just one of those things that slows you down in the field. I wish it was on the right, but I do like it being over there. Really, really like that. As far as the other stuff, like I said, it's just like the Canon R5, its predecessor, and about like the R6 Mark II. The one big change they did do was we now have a full-size, which I love, HDMI port on the side. I love that. The micro HDMIs are a pain. I do a lot of recording out to my Atomos monitors, things like that. And to have a full size is better because your micros, just like I have on the ZVE1 that's filming right here, the jack has gotten loose and half time it doesn't work going the HDMI out. With the full size, you don't have that problem. And it's kind of comical to me right now is because I'm filming with the ZVE1 Sony in front of me to record me here, and my overhead is a Nikon Z6 III. So it's kind of like I'm making the other manufacturers watch the review of the R5. So it's kind of comical to me a little bit. Anyway, back to the camera some more. Let's go to the next part of this camera, and that is what a lot of people are griping about, is this Hotshoe. And they say they have a hard problem. I don't have any problem. You push this button, you kind of pull down the back of it, and then it just pops right off. I think a lot of folks are trying to just push that button down and then push it, and it won't come off. But you push it down in the whole backside, this whole backside, you put your finger on the button and press down the whole piece, not just the button, and then it will just slide right off every time. Because what that does is it puts force on the top and it'll slide off the top lip. When you're just pushing just the button, you're not getting leverage at the top of this thing to push up. But I don't have a problem getting this off here the very first time. I think I've seen a lot of videos they've talked about that, and I think Petapixel made a big joke with the hammer. It's pretty funny. But anyway, that's a really nice. I like it actually that it's really hard to get off or a little stiff on there, because when you put it on, it's not going to pop off. All my other cameras, every camera, I have tons of extra ones, these little caps for the top, and they always come off once you take one off. It's just inevitable. Next, let's talk about the battery that's in this camera. It uses a new battery. It's the LPE6P battery. Yes, I said that right. I had to look to make sure I got the number right. And what happens if you don't use the new battery for this camera? Well, in video, you can't shoot anything except for 30 frames per second. You can't shoot 24, 120, 240, any of that stuff. And you can't record any 8K video, and you can't do raw recording. There's also no dual shooting in movies and stills, where you can do movies and shoot JPEGs at the same time. You can also, in stills, not have the pre-continuous shooting. That's a pre-burst where you hit the shutter. Has slower frames per second in stills also, and the multifunction from shoe accessories may not work, and you have no network capabilities. So that's the caveats. That's why you want to use the new batteries instead of the old batteries. So just make sure you remember that. Now, the battery life is pretty good, what I've noticed on this guy. When I was shooting about half the day, I would burn up one battery. Now, you got to remember, I'm shooting a lot through the first half of the day. It lasts several hours, 2 to 3 hours, with with one battery. And with this battery grip, in a full day shooting, if I didn't charge it in the middle of the day, I still had 50 to 25% of the battery at the end of a long day on these out in the tundra in Barrow. It really has a really good battery life, just like the last camera did with the battery life with the battery grip. It was really good. So I'd suggest you, if you're shooting a lot and shooting all day, get the battery grip. On to the new menus that are in this camera. And yes, it does have new layout of menus. Most things are in the same place, and the layout still to me is very, very logical for the menus on the camera. It has a new menu because there's a lot of new features: pre-capture, video modes, the way the codecs change, the way some of the things work on your autofocus areas are different too. It has an extra little menu item at the top, but it's good the way they broke it out. I like it. But the menus are very sensible. They're not really hard to figure out when you look through them. So I didn't think the new menus were much of a problem. They're still really logical, and I still found a way. I released the first video on the setup, was my initial setup, and I have found some things I've changed differently in the camera, and also soon I'll have a video-centric setup on this thing. So look for those two videos. You're going to have a video that's going to be video-centric on how to do wildlife with video, how I use it. Not the definitive way, the only way, it's just the way I do it. And then I'll have a revised field-tested camera setup video for stills and video, an all-inclusive one soon after that. Probably in a couple, 2 to 3 weeks, probably that'll be out. But the main takeaway is the menus are really easy to navigate and sensible for those of you that have used Canon cameras before. Okay, on to the LCD. The LCD on this camera is bright. It is nice. Nothing really new here. It's 3.2 inch, 2.1 million dot. It has a floppy screen, which we all love, like it's been on the Canon cameras forever. Nothing really new here. Now, the EVF, that's where we're changing quite a bit. Now, on paper, it's the exact same thing. It's a half inch, 5.76 million dot, 120 megahertz OLED screen. But what I've noticed is, and if you see the pictures, that the opening, the eyepiece on this is much larger, and it's very, very welcome. Why is that very welcome? Well, especially if you're like me, to get down low a lot, when you're trying to look through this thing at a weird angle, it's easier to see into that EVF from those angles than it would if you had a smaller view piece here. So that's very, very welcome. The next thing about this view piece is EVF, and it's something that Don really noticed too when he was using it, jumping from his R7, or we're testing the R5. That video is coming out soon, the R5 versus this camera. Which one should you buy? Should you upgrade? Those type things, and the comparisons. This was very, very bright and vivid eyepiece. The specs and everything are exactly the same. I think the backside limited sensor and those things, plus some other magic they've done with opening that eyepiece more, made this where it's really, really good and easy to see your subject, all the detail in your subject and all that stuff. It's just amazing. Even at default levels, and this is one comparison against the R5, I had the R5 cranked all the way up to 5. This one was on default levels, and this was still clearer and brighter than the R5 in the viewfinder, which made shooting incredibly, incredibly nice. The clarity and brightness of this. That's the one thing about this camera that really, really shocked me, and I didn't really think about it at first, but as I kept using it more and more, that's the one thing that I really loved about this, because it made that shooting experience, which is all the point. We're behind this camera all day long. That EVF made the shooting experience for me a lot better. I didn't really think about that in the first day I was shooting it. I was just playing with the controls and stuff, but as I shot it more and more days, that's one thing I liked, is I could see what I'm hitting, I could see my exposure, I could see the details in the bird, like sandhill cranes. I could see the gray and the brown in the wings even when they were flying. That was really nice. Instead of just kind of a gray bird, I'm seeing all the detail. Really nice, really nice. Next thing about the EVF and the controls, and something new on this camera, is the eye control. I did not review the eye control, haven't even turned it on and used it. I tested a bit on the R3, and in use, I just found there's nothing that, the way I shoot, that I would use the eye control for. It just didn't really work in my workflow, and I tested quite a lot with the R3, because I really wanted the R3. I love the controls, the feel, snappiness, everything about the R3, and that's what this camera delivers so far. It feels a lot like the R3 to me as far as its snappiness. Its form in the hand, It's not as smooth as, because it has the grip on here. It's not as smooth, but it's really, really nice. But as far as the snappiness, all those type of things are really good. But I just didn't like the eye control, and it's just not something I'm going to review right now. Maybe in the future I'll review it, but for right now, we're not touching eye control. It's just not something that's going in my workflow currently. Maybe in the future, but I really doubt it, guys. But if you guys want to use your eye control, let me know how it works out for you. But for me, for wildlife photography, it's just not something I'm going to use. Because remember, I'm just using this in my testing and my workflow and my shooting environment is what I do. Now, the biggie, let's get into the really big one on this, that backside illuminated stack sensor. It's got a readout speed at 6.3 milliseconds. What does that mean? Well, that means no rolling shutter, virtually no rolling shutter. There's still a touch if you really push it really hard with something really round, moving and taking compression, things like that. But for me, when I tested this guy, in-flight shots, whip panning this guy with the proper shutter speed, that is, because without the proper shutter speed, you're going to get motion blur, but you're not going to get bowing. And I whip pan this guy hard just to test it with birds in flight and things like that. I didn't see any bend in trees. I didn't see any bend in poles if they were in the way. Anything straight line, I got no bowing at all. I saw no odd wing movements with this guy at 6.3 millisecond. No warping in the images. I looked through images like you can with the R7 and the A7 R5 and things like that. And you will see warping and stretching. You guys who use the R7 or Sony A7 R5s or some slower mirrorless cameras, you'll know what I'm talking about. You're like a log of birds sitting on the bird, and one it's looking normal, the next one is just a little bit taller because the scene warped a little bit. But none of that. Saw none of that in here whatsoever. So that readout speed of the sensor is great, and by having that fast readout speed, this camera can deliver some faster frames per second and items like that. And this guy will shoot up to 30 frames per second in full RAW. Now, 30 frames per second, it is a lot sometimes, but I think really 20 plus is that sweet spot. And I shot this guy expressly in 30 frames per second while testing this, just to see what that shooting workflow is like at 30 frames per second, what that buffer is, and if there's any negatives to shooting 30 frames per second. Well, first of all, the negative is if you're shooting a swan or something that's not moving a lot, a moose, 30 frames per second is a bit much. So in those instances, I'd be shooting 20 frames per second. So in my shooting life as I go forward, after testing this a lot, I'm probably going to set this to 20 frames per second and leave it there, because that's really find that sweet spot, like I said earlier. But there's times when I know I'm going to have a lot of birds flying in-flight shots, or I'm going to have maybe a fox hunting, things that's going to require a lot more action. I'll move it back to 30 frames per second. And that is really nice to have those two options now. The next feature we're talking about, frames per second, is the pre-continuous shooting. This one's the best one to me. Besides that EVF and that stack sensor, this pre-continuous shooting is one of the main reasons that I love this camera. When I shot the A9 III, they had it right. It was RAW, it was in the camera roll. Nikon, still JPEG, pre-continuous. All the other Canon cameras, that pre-shooting, that before you hit the shutter, is in a camera roll. You got to extract it, so I didn't use it. Besides A9 III, it wasn't in my daily shooting repertoire of pre-continuous shooting. I love pre-continuous shooting, pre-shutter shooting, that is, because you can get those things that you would have missed before. A pike barking, you're trying to time it right when you see his bark. Extremely hard. You don't know where they're going to do it. It just happens out of nowhere. By having that pre-shooting, which what is pre-continuous shooting? Let's explain that first. It basically, if you're holding the shutter halfway down, it's recording a rolling recording of half second before you hit the shutter. So let's say that pike is barking. I see him bark, I hit the shutter, but I missed it. It was just a hair before I hit it. As long as it was in half second before I hit the shutter button, I should capture that bark. And that's what it does. So birds taking off on a tree, pike barking, all those kind of things, that's what it does. I kicked my camera, so I hope that didn't mess up the shot too much there for a second. But that's what pre-continuous shooting is, and it's fantastic, and it's part of the camera roll now. So I left that on all the time. So at 30 frames per second, that means I was getting 15 frames per second before I hit the shutter. What does that also mean? Well, that means you're filling that card up a lot more. So even if I took 10 shots, I got 25 shots because that 15 prior. But that right there is one of the best features for this camera for me, for wildlife photography, besides that EVF and that sensor speed at 6.3 seconds. Just incredible. I love it. I love having it. There was a lot of shots I wouldn't have got if I hadn't had that. And that's what makes that pre-continuous shooting very, very nice. Now, one thing to note about the pre-continuous shooting is it only shoots in ECS, electronic shutter only. So remember that. It's not going to be shooting mechanical at first curtain. Even if you have it set to that, it's going to shoot in ECS only. And how you know that pre-continuous is working, when you half press that shutter, what you'll notice in the top left, you'll see a little pre-circle popping. So when you're hitting that halfway down, you'll see that pre. If you don't want the pre, and you've got it set, just don't half press that guy. Just when you see it, then hit your shutter instead of hitting halfway down, then hitting your shutter, and you won't get that half second because you didn't hold it down long enough. Now, with 30 frames per second selected and pre-continuous shooting on, you're going to have a lot of image, like I said earlier, so you're going to have a lot more culling. Yes, that is a negative to that. So there's always pros and cons to everything. And in a day out in the field, especially when I was out in Barrow, I was shooting 6,000 to 15,000 shots easily in a day. A couple times I had 20,000. So it is a lot of things to go through, a lot more culling, but being able to get that shot that you would have not gotten before, like some of these blast off shots or fly off shots or landing shots and things, when I would see it hit that button, I was getting more of the action that I would have missed before. So again, I've said it several times, pre-continuous, just awesome. Let's move on to weather sealing. Now, when I took this to Barrow, we had snow, we had rain, we had fog, we had snow, sand, tundra muck, mud, water, everything. And one thing I didn't do on purpose is I did not put this in a raincoat. Didn't do it. I wanted to weather test this. I know, stupid again, but I wanted to see how this thing held up, to let you guys know and let myself know. The predecessor camera of this guy held up really well in the rain and all those type things. And this one did fantastic too. It was in some extremely cold weather too. It was below 30 degrees most days up there. And we had wind blowing 40 degrees coming off the ocean. So it felt like the wind chill was down in single digits easily at times. It was really, really cold. And how did it hold up? Extremely, extremely well. Had no issues except for a little bit of sand. So when I was out shooting, I got a touch a bit of sand in this dial here. When I would pull it down, run it, and we've all had that happen on these dials and Canon cameras, you hear a little bit of grit. There's a piece of sand under there. But after rolling that around quite a bit in the car, after I noticed it, that piece of sand worked its way out and not a problem. The other thing that happened was I had a little bit of sand get stuck in the shutter button. And what I noticed when I was looking through the eyepiece, I wasn't holding the shutter. I noticed the pre-shooting was down. That's why I knew there was something in there. So it was partially holding the shutter down, but not all the way, luckily. So again, how did I fix that? Turned the camera off and just kept working, jiggling that shutter button, pushing it back and forth, on and off, and that piece of sand worked its way out. And I was back to shooting. But other than that, the weather seal on this guy held out great. So sand and dirt getting in your camera is always going to be a problem, these buttons. It's just never going to go away because there's just enough of a gap for a piece to get in there. But just as you get done shooting in those environments, wipe your camera down, look through it, it looks good. But as far as weather sealing, this guy is fantastic. Buffer performance. Let's talk about that real quick. So the buffer on this camera, how did it do? Because I was a little concerned about 30 frames per second with 45 megapixels. With that, I was curious how they did the buffer in this guy. And I did record some times with this. And just to let you know, with feel-wise, when I first rattled off that shutter when I had a bird coming and landing or flying across the sky on the very first day of shooting it, I smacked that buffer really quick. It kind of surprised me. And I shot again. I shot this guy mostly in 30 frames per second out in the field. And I shot it in RAW first, then I moved to C-RAW later to see if that would help. And it did help. I was getting more time behind the shutter as it's going. But how did the shots go and how long did it run? Let's talk about those numbers real quick. So in RAW, what I got at 30 frames per second in full RAW, I'm gonna get 113 shots off. And it took about 3 to almost 3.5 seconds to hit that buffer, where basically the camera stops taking pictures. And then it has to clear the buffer. So it took about 2 seconds to clear that buffer where you see busy. And after that, it took a total of 3 more seconds to write those to the card. So what does that mean? Well, when you hit that buffer, when it goes clunk, stops, the next time you can hit your images to get more images or flip to video is going to be 2 seconds after that. So one of the things you got to note too about this camera, if you go to turn it off or try to go to video after shooting a burst and you hit the buffer or shoot a good burst, you're going to have to wait about 1 to 2 seconds in RAW before you can start shooting video or shooting more stills or the camera to go off. So that's why you get that busy in there. And at 20 frames per second in RAW, what I got was 122 shots. Not that many more, but I could shoot for 4.5 seconds versus 3 seconds. So I could shoot longer. And to clear that buffer, it took just a little less than 2 seconds. And to totally clear it off to right at the card was 5 seconds. So to go to video or to shoot more, it was about 1.5 to 2 seconds for it to clear that buffer for the busy signal to go away. Now, when I moved into C-RAW, this is what I really wanted to know when I was shooting 30 frames per second, and it did help me. So in C-RAW at 30 frames per second, I was getting 225 shots, almost double. And it was lasting for 5 seconds in C-RAW when I was shooting 30 frames per second. It took 1 second to clear that busy, really nice, and it took 5 seconds for it to write to the card. So that little stutter was about 1 second to 2 seconds when you got more and more stutters if you just left that hammer down the whole time. But it was 1 second to clear that buffer, 225 shots. When I moved to 20 frames per second, I was only getting 24 shots, but I was holding that button down for 8 seconds. And it took 2.5 seconds for it to clear the buffer, the busy signal, and 8 seconds completely to write to the card. So what does that mean? Well, if you have a bird like a swan that takes a long time to get off the ground, you'll probably want to be shooting in 20 frames per second. C-RAW gives you 8 seconds because those guys take 75 yards sometimes to get up. So it takes a long time for them. Because what happens invariably, you feather your buffer. That's the second. That's the part you really wanted to get. But for the most part, I left it in C-RAW 30 frames per second. So 225 shots in 5 seconds worked really good for me. I still slapped that buffer when I had like Jaegers flying through the sky, you know, trying to stay with them when I had them head on. They would curve in that wind and do stuff, and 5 seconds sometimes wasn't enough. You have to get off, get back on the shutter. But that's what the numbers are. So again, 30 frames per second, 113 frames, 20 frames per second RAW, 122 frames. In C-RAW, 225 and 240 for 30 and 20. You're not getting that many more shots, but what you're getting is more time on the shutter, which is really nice. All right, now let's talk about ISO and low light performance. And just so you know, we're going to have a separate video on its own that will just cover this to show you examples and more in depth on low light and that type stuff. And everything I shot with this camera was in low to lower light to no light. We had 2 days in the anchors where we had semi-okay light. That was the last video you saw, and another day we had grebes and some sandhill crane, stuff like that. The rest of the time is severe overcast, raining, fog, blowing rain, blowing snow. At times in Barrow, in the middle of the day, it looked like it was dusk. Now the result, pretty good as expected. Shooting at 10,000 ISO was, again, no issue. And we don't have DxO working currently, and the images look pretty good. Now remember that. And once we get DxO working for the R5 Mark II, then we'll revisit the low light performance. But even without it, I was pretty happy with it. And why I'm saying no DxO, and these images you see that you'll see throughout this video, I did not apply any Lightroom noise reduction or any sharpness. Didn't run it through topaz or anything. Just edited what I could in Lightroom without doing any noise reduction and sharpness, just to show you kind of what it looks like if you had to edit your images. But overall, I was fairly happy with it, looking at it, because I was really worried about what that low light was going to be like without those tools. Because with the last camera, I wasn't unhappy with it, but I definitely had to run it through DxO. These need to be ran through DxO too. It would help these images a lot more to get the color back, the sharpness right, and the noise reduction. But as it sits right now, the low light for me looks pretty good, because that's all I shot in is low light, just low, crappy light. But the images to me came out pretty good. Next, image stabilization. Image stabilization in stills was very, very good. I could shoot some extremely low shutter speeds, handheld, and not get too much motion blur. The image stabilization that Canon quotes is 8.5 stops with the right lenses, and I think you got that. And in video, just wow. You can really see it lock in. When you're setting up your shot before you hit the shutter button or the record button to start recording, you could see the movement and shake. But once you hit that record button, that thing just locked in and stuck. And it was really good. And the focus stayed on that bird also. When we get to autofocus, we'll talk about that. But when that IS kicked in the video, it was nice because on this trip in Barrow, I didn't take a tripod, ground skimmer, gimbals, nothing. I had to handhold that or find something to rest the camera on. When I'm trying to film birds in flight with that EF 11-pound body and lens, actually almost 12 pounds, that was tough to handhold, and that image stabilization really helped to lock that in. Just great work by Canon on the image stabilization on this new camera. The next thing I know that a lot of people want to know about this camera, and that's the autofocus. That's what a lot of people came here to see. How good is the autofocus on this guy in birds and animals? What does it look like with this new sensor and this new dual processor type thing we got going on? Well, from the very first bird I shot out of focus, when I hit the AF on for the animal eye detect, first thing I noticed was that was fast. The jump to subject on this guy is impressive. When you hit that button out of focus, jump into that eye, really fast. It's the one thing that Don mentioned is he's testing this camera out along with the R5 because he's thinking about maybe getting an R5 since the R5 Mark II came out, just because he may be able to find some deals in the R5. But that's the one comparison he made on that, was this autofocus compared to his R7. The R5 was really snappy. We'll have that comparison and showing you what that comparison looks like as far as how quick they acquire very soon. And the stickiness on this guy is very good also. It really hung on the subjects when they're moving through their frame. When they went through some busy environments or behind things, it tracked them really well. I didn't even need to go into the autofocus settings and change that auto to go to manual to make it less or more sticky. Leaving it auto to me worked really good. I've seen some people say they need to change their tracking situations. I didn't have to do that in this guy. And I shot birds against crazy backgrounds, through things, and I really didn't have any issues grabbing that bird. Of course, if you're shooting in some tricky where you're trying to get your initial focus behind some twigs, yeah, you're going to have to use single point to get by, but that's for all autofocus. But once it locked, I didn't have much of a problem with that. And for birds in flight, the result was the same. It grabbed quickly. It hung on very well. We shot some sandhill cranes that flew really low against trees where normally the autofocus gets lost in a lot of my cameras. And this guy just hung on to them the whole time. It was really nice. Again, you got to get the right contrast to the, between the animal and the background, but I didn't have a lot of contrast, but it really hung on well as it went through that type of background, which is a good testament to this camera. We even shot some small birds across the tundra in bad light with lots of distractions. Actually, one was in a cemetery, and it nailed focus. Like you can see with this bunting as it's going back there, it's going away from me, and it's just tracking that bunting. Buntings aren't that big. They're little bitty birds, snow bunties. But it tracked that bird. Of course, it's all butt shots the whole way, but it was just nice to see it tracked and held on to that little bird that's flying away. Overall, I was very impressed with the autofocus and stills for this guy. Now, hit rate. So it's all good and dandy that the autofocus and the camera setting got to it. But when you get into the images, you're going to look at the images that in that focus range. What was the hit rate like? Well, this really surprised me. It was really good. As you can see here with this eagle, I've got two bursts I'll show you here. I think the first one is going to be at 255 frames. I've just got it sped up where you click through the frames. This is an eagle in horrible light. Laying down in the muck, shooting across the water, which is a tricky situation. It's a bigger bird, yes. The immature bald eagle that this one is, the eye on the eagle is darker. It's not like with the adult eagle where the eye is white, where it really is easy for it to find. It's really more muted to the face of the bird. As you can see, you don't really see it. But it locked the eye. It locked that bird. When the bird would jump, the focus would stay on it because the bird was jumping up a little to me, a little away from me, and higher. And I was fairly close to this bird. I'll have the distance of the bird here somewhere in it. But it locked on. It stayed on. As you can see, I don't have one picture out of focus. The second one is about 155 frames, and the other one I showed you a minute ago with that bunting, I think it was like 50 frames. But again, what you'll see is the autofocus did not, it kept the lens where it needed to be, and every shot was in focus. So the hit rate to me was extremely well with this camera. Is another thing that kind of surprised me with this camera. I didn't see any drift, and that's one thing I really worry about with these cameras, autofocus systems, especially like the R7 and some others, is even though the autofocus says, hey, I'm locked, you know, the lock box is on the eye or the body, but you look back at your image, you'll see a few get out of focus. I found very little of those. When it said it was locked, it put the motors where it needed to be for the lens. So I thought it was really, really good for the hit rate on this camera. I was really surprised with it. So the video autofocus, this one really shocked me also. More so than the stills. I knew the stills would be good if they got better with the autofocus, like I saw with the R6 Mark II and the R8, things like that. I knew the autofocus has got to get better than that, so it's going to be good. But the video autofocus was fantastic. What I noticed was when I had a bird in frame, I didn't have the focus. I could see, I know the bird was there, a Jaeger or something, and I see the blur. I know the bird's there. As soon as I hit the shutter button to start the video, that continuous autofocus just grabbed that bird and stuck on that bird and stayed on that bird. I had almost no times where the autofocus would get lost. Now, if I had two birds really close to each other, sometimes it may drift to the other one, but they had to be really close to each other for it to drift over, or I would tell it to drift over by hitting a button on the back. The only time I had it happen where it got lost, and all my cameras would have got lost in this thing with video, is I had a grebe sitting out in some lily pads, amongst them. And that grebe was about the same color as the lily pads. And when I got the focus locked, got the video rolling, every once in a while it would kind of go it kind of slowly pulls out of focus, trying to hit the, one of those lily pads instead of the bird. The bird was way across the water too, so it was all small in frame. I didn't really expect it to grab, but it did better than I thought, but it still would get lost. But that was the extreme, and none of my cameras would have tracked that anyway. That's the only time I had it drift off. So the autofocus in video is good, and overall the autofocus on this guy, like all the Canon cameras have been in the mirrorless since the R5 post those, all the cameras came after that one. Really, really, really good autofocus on this guy. Let's talk about video on this guy. So for video is something that I need a lot. I jump from stills to video for this channel to record the animals. And the video on this was really, really nice. You can shoot up to 8K on this guy and raw recording. You can also shoot up to 24 frames per second. Me, I'm not as concerned about 8K as we can't shoot those really high speed frame rates at 120 to 240. Yes, you can shoot up to 8K 60, but I need 120 frames a second or more to get those really slow things. So I'm shooting 4K or 1080p most of the time. So most of the time, 99% of the time, I'm shooting 120 frames a second. So I'm shooting in 4K on this guy. And that's the max resolution you can get. If you want to shoot 240 frames a second, so maybe I know I'm going to have something that's really nutty, I want to shoot 240, I can only shoot in 1080p, which is fine. I can upscale that later in Final Cut Pro, or if you use DaVinci Resolve, you can upgrade it. You can not upgrade it, but upscale it there to 4K there. And how did it perform? Well, really, really well. I shot just a little bit at the 240 frames a second just to see what it looked like. At 1080p, looked great. Looked really, really good. And most of the time, I shot this in 4K, 120 frames per second, pretty much everywhere I went. And it performed extremely well. As you can see from the video, you saw in the last video what little footage you have in here and what the subsequent videos coming. We'll have a whole video about how to set up the video. We'll talk about video recording too, a little bit in the field maybe. Now, one thing I want to talk about real quick is kind of a gotcha in this guy in crop mode. What it does to you, you got to be aware of, because it caught me, is if you're going to move this guy into crop mode, you can't shoot 4K 120. The highest resolution you can shoot is 2K 120 in crop mode. So what happens if you're in 4K 120 and you move this into crop mode? It will default your camera from 4K 120 to 4K 60. It doesn't go 2K 120. It keeps your resolution but drops your frame rate. So what happened to me, I was shooting 4K 120, I moved into crop mode, I'm shooting, I get back to the house later, I start trying to edit video, and I notice everything is 4K 60. That really hurt because I wanted to slow that down quite a bit. I can only slow it down half speed instead of 50%, instead of 20%, making it slower. So I got caught there where I couldn't really slow that last video down a lot because I had 4K 60. It was the last video that got me. So what you've got to do is, a lot of times I was shooting 2K 120 the total time when I knew I was going to go into crop mode and out of crop mode. So be aware of that. If you want to shoot crop mode, 2K 120 is the best you can shoot as far as you want to shoot on 20 frames a second. So watch out for that gotcha. All right, now let's talk about image quality. This is not a final for image quality on this thing, but we can look at image quality as we have it now. Why is that? Because like I said, DxO is not working for this guy, and the profiles in Lightroom are kind of sketchy also. And for me, DxO has to be on workflow. I need that camera profile, lens profile. I need the color settings from the manufacturer. I need the sharpening and the noise reduction that the manufacturer said that should be in that image. Kind of like what you see in a JPEG image. And it's not here yet, but we can look at it as it sits today to look at that IQ of this camera, the image coming out of it. And to me, it's very good. You can judge for yourself, tell what you think in the comments down below, what you think of the image, what they look like. Like I said, I did edit these images, but I did apply no sharpening, no noise reduction to any of these images. I just edited them for color and cropping, things like that. And always with the Canon 5 series cameras at 45 megapixels, it's really nice. You got a lot of room to crop in, and the detail is amazing, and the colors are the traditional good Canon colors, like, you know, a little more poppy, magentas, things like that, as opposed to Nikon and the contrast of Sony. But I really liked what was coming out of this guy. But again, let's not be the final judge on IQ until we get DxO working. But for what I'm seeing right now, as you can look at these little images that I'm kind of showing you through here, and the last video, it to me looks really good. The colors from Canon are pretty poppy, look great, looked really nice. As far as video IQ, standard and C-Log 2, in C-Log 2, it looked really, really good. It had a lot of detail, a lot of colors. I could pull in and out of this hand grain, and it looked really nice. I could really tell a difference from C-Log 3 to C-Log 2 as far as what I could recover out of that when shooting video. Now, I'm under a tight schedule. I'm trying to get a lot of videos out, so I don't have time to grade all the footage. It takes time. So for the most of the time, I shot this in just standard colors right out of the camera, and they look great. From what I color graded to what those standard colors were, they were pretty close. Yes, I could get a little more out of those C-Log 2 files, but the standard colors, leaving the, the color profiles off, or just using the Canon, and I just left it in auto. I didn't put it in standard or any other color settings for the video. It looked really good. All that video you're seeing on the last video, all but one clip, and if you could find it, let me know. They were all standard, standard Canon colors, and one C-Log 2 clip in that whole video. If you can find it, let me know. I'll tell you if you're right or not. But for the image quality out of the video, great. The details, great. Tracking's great. And the autofocus, like I talked before, couldn't be happier with the video and the IQ coming out of this. So my conclusion on this camera, it's very good. It's actually better than my expectations. I knew it'd be good, as the R5 was a great camera, but this thing really impressed me. The EVF alone was a huge factor in getting good shots. The clarity and brightness of the subject made getting focus and exposure much, much easier. There was something that Don and I kept coming back to about this camera, just about how good everything looked through that viewfinder. The pre-continuous shooting, being in the camera roll now and how it's working, was clutch in wildlife photography for me, especially in the way my shooting needs are. To capture that moment that a lot of times I would miss was so nice to have in the arsenal. The autofocus snappiness and stickiness was very, very good. I didn't miss many bird and flight shots if I could swing and get them in the viewfinder. I could just swing that lens around and grab them very easily. It just worked and worked well. Now, getting low along the water and grass when the bird is partially obscured, I did have to single point sometimes to get the focus plane, but it seemed much less neat on the R5 Mark II than some of the other cameras I use. So don't think it grabs in every situation, as no camera does. The video stabilization and tracking is amazing on this camera. The stabilization was very noticeable and made handling a large prime lens much, much easier. So far, everything about this camera has been great, and as I said, more than I expected when I started. We put this thing through the ringer, very challenging light and weather, and it survived and didn't give me any fits really. And most importantly, getting the shots was very, very easy due to the camera's performance and features. It checked all the boxes I need in a workhorse portfolio capturing camera. One that you could choose to put in your bag if you're going to go somewhere special to make sure you can form at your best and get the shot. The only issues I had so far has been the battery grip issue, which we talked about before, with it saying it's out of power, but you just popped it back in and it worked. And the one time it locked up, and again, power cycle got it back in. So really, 2 battery issues and 1 power issue. That was really it. Things that I don't like on the camera aren't that much. And the one gripe is something that almost none of you would ever have to deal with, and that's the HDMI out when hooking up the camera and external recorder, like to an Atomos Ninja. You still can't see through the viewfinder when you hook that up. So that makes me, when I want to show you things like birds in flight or the autofocus, really hard, because instead of looking through the viewfinder here, I have to look through the screen that's on top, and capturing a bird in flight is almost impossible for me to try to do that with this camera with a long lens, trying to line that bird up. That's why if you do see bird in flight stuff, it's really shaky or it's a really slow moving bird. But I wish they'd get that right. Nikon does it. They go from this out to the HDMI to the Atomos to the recorder, and you have no issues with it whatsoever. So Canon, please get that fixed. Give us that ability to go to HDMI out and still see through the viewfinder. Along with that, just having that camera stills video switch on the right to the left would be nicer. The price tag is a little bit of a thing that's hard to swallow at $4,300, but that's what it is for this guy. To me, it seems a little bit steep. Now, the last thing is if Canon will just put out a pro level wildlife RF lens, that'd be nice. There's a rant video coming for that pretty soon. But besides that, guys, I hope this video sheds some more light on this camera. We have a lot more videos coming soon on this guy. Comparison to the R5 and should you upgrade. Maybe comparison of the colors versus Z8, Z9 cameras. The video setting performance, low light performance, IQ as we get DXI ready more and more. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and set up your notifications so you don't miss anything of those videos. And always, guys, until next time we see each other, get outside and go run that shutter.